Welcome to Sunday night of our Believe online conference. I hope that you've enjoyed your time so far if you've been part of the weekend. If not, if you're just tuning in tonight, the previous sessions, Friday and Saturday night, are available online. You can watch them when you want here, but great that you've taken the time this weekend to be part of our conference. Dr. Aaron Perry is sharing tonight. He's a professor at Wesley Seminary. He is a friend. He was my roommate in college. We have a shared story there together. So glad he's going to be sharing on the resurrection tonight. Key and crucial to everything, what he is sharing tonight. And glad that you've decided to tune in. As a reminder, just again, conference entirely free. Been great to do some giveaways through the weekend. But if you would like to give towards this project, Project Solid Start, we are partnering with World Hope Canada to do some great work in the country of Bosnia, helping early educators prepare kids for elementary school that wouldn't have a chance to even get there without the support of this program. So $4,000 is our goal. We're starting off with $2,000, not too much farther to go. If you'd like to give towards that, it would be a huge blessing to them. Would mean a ton to us as well. Partner with us that way. Click on myparkwaychurch.ca, click on giving, go to World Hope, and there'll be some links there where you can give and be part of this great thing that we're doing, that they're doing, and to bless you that way. Enjoy a conference. Last night here, grab your tablet, grab a piece of paper, pen, take some notes tonight, be involved in some great conversation. God bless you.
A man named Jesus was put to death by the collusion of governing authorities, both religious and political. And after a day and a half of being dead, he was seen again alive. He was seen by a lot of people, at least some of whom were credible. A movement started or has continued in his name and has been going on for 2,000 years. Now, in this last paragraph, I've introduced three components. Number one, a man named Jesus was put to death by religious and political authorities. Number two, this same man was raised from the dead in the fullest sense, in his body. Number three, a movement has continued in his name and has been ongoing for 2,000 years. Now, the first and the third of this claim, I believe, are indisputable. There's simply too much evidence that a man named Jesus lived and was put to death. And the third claim is obvious. This conversation is part of it. The church up the street, around the corner, the church that's located on every continent is part of this global movement that's been ongoing since his death. There's simply too much evidence to deny the first claim and too much experience to deny the third. But in between these two claims is something disputable. Jesus was raised from the dead in his body. I mean it. Jesus was raised from the dead in nothing less than what you think that phrase should mean. He was dead, no heartbeat, organs not functioning, breath not taken, blood not pumping. He was buried in a cave because he was dead, and he was raised, beating heart, organs functioning, blood pumping, lungs filling with breath, body in the world. Now, if this happened, a man was put to death and was raised to new life, then the whole world, all of history, and your particular life is impacted. So I think it's a claim worth considering. Now, it's possible that you don't believe in the resurrection. If that's the case, I expect there are one of four reasons. Number one, you don't believe in the resurrection because no one has ever told you about the resurrection. You don't believe because you've never heard of it. This might be the first time you've ever heard about a man named Jesus who lived in Nazareth in northern Israel about 2,000 years ago. And it's the first time you're hearing about him being raised from the dead. And that's why you don't believe. Number two, you might not believe in the resurrection because somebody told you that it's baloney. You don't believe because someone else hasn't found the claims credible and they don't believe it, and they told you you shouldn't believe in it either. You might even be inclined to be against the resurrection or against believing in it because of the claims of somebody else. Number three, you might not believe in the resurrection because nobody around you believes in the resurrection. This is different from the first claim. You might have heard somebody tell you about Jesus, maybe even grew up in church. Maybe you've heard this claim before, but no one around you, there's no community that believes in the resurrection and has shaped their life according to serving the one who was raised from the dead. You know about it, but you haven't had any encouragement to believe it. Number four, you don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead because you've investigated the claims, you found the evidence, and you found it lacking. Out of all these reasons, I think only one is a good reason not to believe in the resurrection. Number four, the only good reason that you should have not to believe in the resurrection is that you've investigated the claims and found them wanting. Now, I'm confident, I'm not certain, but I am confident if you research the question with an open mind, looking for all the evidence that you can find, and with an open heart, allowing yourself actually to have the experience of hope and belief, that you will come to the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. He really existed, he really was put to death, and he really was seen again alive, bodily alive, by many people. In this talk, maybe it's the start of a conversation, perhaps with me or another Christian or a local church, I want to do two things. First, I want to give you a reason to research this claim that Jesus really was raised from the dead. Second, I want to give you some initial reasons to believe this claim. So I want to encourage you to research it. And secondly, I want to give you some of the reasons that I think you should find this claim credible. To do this, I want to tell you a story. Now, I don't mean a fable. I mean, I want to tell you an entertaining account of a series of real events and actual actions. It's a story from a longer account that the early church named the Gospel according to Luke. It's a biography of Jesus. Gospel simply means good news or announcement. And the Gospel according to Luke is like a biography of Jesus. It's Luke's account of Jesus's life. And it's found in what we call the Bible. Now, there might already be some people who are skeptical. They already want to know why I'm using the Bible to talk about resurrection. They might think that to use a book that is part of the Bible, like the Gospel according to Luke, is already to give up part of the aims of critical investigation. Now, there are two reasons that you might be skeptical about me talking about the resurrection from the Bible. Number one, you might say, well, to use the Bible is to use cooked evidence, right? It's to presume the conclusion, or it's to present evidence that's already been manufactured to try to bring you to a certain belief. But I don't think this is the case. Think about it like this. Suppose that Jesus of Nazareth really was buried and raised from the dead. What would you expect to happen? Would you expect people to talk about it? I think so. Would you expect people to write about it? Would you expect people who had experienced Jesus or who had been told about this claim and had investigated it to read these writings, or at least to listen to them? Now, I think the answer to all of these questions is yes. If Jesus was raised from the dead, people would talk about it, people would write about it, and people would read and listen to these writings. Now, the Bible is not one book. It's a library of writings. And some of the writings emerged after the life of Jesus, made it into this book, and others didn't. In other words, some accounts of Jesus' life weren't deemed to be credible by the early church, but others were deemed to be credible. To use the Bible isn't to use cooked evidence, but to consider evidence that was gathered together that was already found to be credible. That doesn't mean you need to find it credible, but that others have. It's like looking at evidence that's already in the case file. Let me give you an illustration. Suppose you and I are friends, and you have a friend that I don't know. His name is Jesse. I say to you, hey, I heard about Jesse, and I heard that you know him. Can you tell me about Jesse? You might say, oh, sure. I'll show you some pictures on my phone. You pull out your phone and you open up an album entitled Most Important Pictures of Jesse. Suddenly I blurt out and I say, no, stop. Those don't count. I need to see other pictures. You might try to reassure me. You say, oh, no. These ones are the best. Let me just open up the album. They show Jesse doing a bunch of different things. They give you a really good picture of who he is. But I'm skeptical. And I say, but you've gathered them together and put them in one place. Well, now you might be confused. Well, of course, you say. It's a lot easier for me to tell people about Jesse when these pictures are gathered together. That way, I can just swipe left and right. I can swipe back and forth and show you all these different pictures and tell you about them. Now, after looking at these pictures, I might decide that they present a person I don't really think I'd like to meet. Maybe Jesse doesn't cheer for the right sports teams. Or maybe after looking at the pictures, I decide that there's a little more to the story than about Jesse, and I want to explore further. But just because the pictures are gathered together in one place in an album doesn't mean that I shouldn't consider them. In fact, the fact that they are already gathered shows that someone thinks enough of this friend to go through all their pictures and make an album. The New Testament is kind of like a collection of pictures of Jesus that the early church gathered together. The Gospel of Luke is part of the New Testament. To consider an ancient writing about an ancient event is not to presume whether the ancient event happened or not. It would be foolish not to consider this text. So I'm going to tell you a story from an ancient book about an ancient event. I think that just makes sense. Now, the second reason you might be skeptical about me using a text from the Bible is that you might consider the Bible to be insignificant evidence. In the journal Scientific American, Michael Shermer describes what he calls the principle of proportionality. In an article called "What Would It Take to Prove the Resurrection?" Shermer describes this principle of In a Scientific American article entitled "What Would It Take to Prove the Resurrection?" author Michael Shermer mentions the principle of proportionality. The principle, as Shermer describes it, says that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, I know what Shermer means. He is saying that if an ordinary claim is already somewhat believable because it's common, that an extraordinary claim is at least somewhat unbelievable because it's uncommon. To believe in something extraordinary, then, means that I need to back it up with something extraordinary. Extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. That's the claim. But I don't think this is really true, or at least true in the most meaningful sense. Let me give an example. Slam! That was all that I heard as I felt my car being driven from behind by a large truck into the side of a bus, spinning around and coming to rest in the middle of a busy road, completely demolished on both ends. Now, in some ways, being rear-ended in my little Ford Escort was an extraordinary event. It has never happened to me since. Do you believe this story? If you're inclined to maybe believe it or disbelieve it, you might want to investigate the claim. You might even ask me for more evidence. To do so, I could bring all kinds of evidence, maybe evidence like other witnesses or photographs of my car. In fact, there's some right up here. I could give you insurance claims. There's evidence to this event, but none of it is really extraordinary. It's all ordinary. Testimony and photographs and the account itself. Now, you might say that this event is ordinary. Car accidents happen all the time. Even if it was remarkable to me, you might say that other people have car accidents, and that's what makes them ordinary or common. But when the accident was being investigated by insurance companies, they didn't just say, "Oh yeah, that's common. We believe what you're saying." They still wanted evidence as to what happened, so they investigated. They didn't have extraordinary evidence to investigate, so what were they looking for? They were maybe looking for the amount of evidence, the kind of evidence. Was it strong or was it weak? And was it consistent? They were looking for the consistency of my story and the accounts of other people. I think it's fair to say that the Bible is really extraordinary, but not in the same way the resurrection is. The resurrection truly is extraordinary because it didn't just happen once to Jesus. This is an event that's happened once in the history of the world. Now, I do think the New Testament is extraordinary in its preservation, its collection, its existence, but it's filled with everyday kind of evidence: letters, testimony, accounts, instructions. If Jesus was raised from the dead, then his resurrection is truly an extraordinary event. I think the raising of a person to life who will not die again has only happened so far this one time in this way. But a lot of evidence to it is all rather ordinary, which is exactly what you would expect. In fact, we could say that the extraordinary evidence is already hard to believe. Extraordinary evidence itself wouldn't be very common, and so we might be disinclined to believe extraordinary evidence. Instead, we do have an extraordinary event, the resurrection of Jesus, that's backed up by ordinary, consistent evidence. That's exactly what we would expect, and it's what we're going to consider. That's what we have: ordinary evidence, written documents built on oral testimony and events that follow and fit the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. Simply to dismiss the resurrection because we don't have something extraordinary is to miss the nature of the evidence we do have. So, I am asking you to consider the resurrection. And to consider the resurrection, just to begin, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story that's worth considering because it's an ancient document and it's an ordinary piece of evidence, exactly what we would expect. Now, this story, as I mentioned, is part of a biography that the earliest Christians called Luke, or the Gospel according to Luke. We're going to jump into the story somewhere near the end. This biography has already told us about Jesus' life, including accounts of his healing, his teaching, his trial, and his death. And it has just recorded about some women who went to the Jesus tomb and found it empty. There, they found two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning, who told them that Jesus was not there, but was raised from the dead. The reaction of some people to this testimony of the women is exactly what you would expect. Some people say, "This is nonsense." Another man goes to the tomb to see for himself. He investigates. But 2 others just take off for home. This is their story. The gospel according to Luke. Now, that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing them. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened in these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked them. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the 3rd day since all this has taken place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah or King have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures according to himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening and the day is almost over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us as he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It's true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon Peter." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way, how Jesus was recognized them when he broke the bread. That's the story that I want to use to encourage you to investigate the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. Let me give you 3 reasons why. The first reason I'd like you to consider the resurrection of Jesus is because of the presence of this very testimony. I said that this story is in a longer story referred to the gospel of Jesus according to Luke. But notice that this story doesn't come from Luke himself, the name of the person to whom this writing was attributed. Luke did this investigation, but he wasn't at this event. Luke doesn't show up in this text. That means it's testimony. The only way we have this story is because 1 or more of 3 people shared it: Jesus, Cleopas, or an unnamed person who's also on the road with him. Now, we might be skeptical of testimony because there are fewer people who can corroborate the story, only 1 of 3. But there are some strengths to this testimony. First, there's a name attached to it, Cleopas. And there's a region attached to this name, Emmaus. These are details that could be tracked and verified. Second, the testimony is costly, and it's costly in 2 ways. First, it's costly because Cleopas and his companion aren't presented in the best light. They hear about the resurrection and they don't believe it. In fact, they take off. Second, it's costly because they will be accountable to a way of living associated with this experience. Cleopas and his companion will need to live a life in accordance with the testimony that's given here. Now, you might say that this story just never happened. Cleopas never existed, his companion never existed, and Jesus never met with them. But this doesn't actually solve the problem of having testimony. It just pushes it back, because we have the testimony of this whole biography. We have the evidence of this writing called the Gospel of Luke, which was an investigation. And it's attached to names and places too. It's attached to real people at real places in real time in history. This gospel begins by claiming it's an investigation into the claims of Jesus. Now, I think this is really interesting. The location in this story is called Emmaus, and different early manuscripts Manuscripts are copies of the original, even over generations. Different early manuscripts have different distances because several places in the ancient Near East that could have been connected to Jerusalem were referred to as Emmaus. At first, this might be a bit disconcerting. We might ask, well, which Emmaus was it? But when you think about it, it's actually kind of affirming of the text. People much closer to the event, both in time and space, did exactly what I'm suggesting you do, and that's investigate. Their investigation tried to clear up what the first text meant, which is evidence that it wasn't invented in the first place. It stood up to investigation, even if some questions remained. They took seriously what this biography had to say, and I suggest you do the same. Likewise, this biography brought with it great cost of time and money to investigate, cost of money and time to write. And it was also costly to the character of the writer. Someone had to write it, and they would be accountable to what was written in it. Once we say, okay, testimony shouldn't automatically be discounted, and it provides some evidence to the claim itself, then we can see an even deeper benefit to testimony because it's a kind of personal experience. And personal experience brings a perspective that is unique to every event. It gives information that nobody else has. This past summer, the eyes of many in the United States and around the world were reopened to experiences of racism, the unfounded judgment and unfair treatment of people in part or whole because of the color of their skin. One of the most significant encouragements in this whole experience was for people to listen to those who had not simply seen racism, but who had experienced it against them. The person who experienced racism personally has a vantage point that others simply don't. Last winter, I was doing some interviews for a work project, and I met a woman of color who shared with me her and her family's experience of racism. By her sharing her personal experience through her testimony, I was given a glimpse into accounts that I couldn't have received except that they were her testimony. The experience of an event put into testimony contains truth that others simply cannot grasp unless they are told the experience. This is part of why testimony simply isn't acceptable, but it's vital for us to investigate the claims of resurrection. What does this have to do with the resurrection? People have investigated and told the story of Jesus' resurrection several times, over time, across regions, at personal cost, social cost, and with testable details. It's worth investigating. It's worth investigating the resurrection because of the presence of testimony. The second thing I'd like you to see about this story that will encourage you to investigate the claim to resurrection because of the presence of testimony is that it puts the whole story of Jesus' life at risk. Look at what Cleopas and his companions share. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. This status is given to Jesus, a prophet who's powerful in word and deed. It's a strong status. It really matters. It's important. To be recognized as a prophet was a bigger deal. This is part of a variety of testimonies and accounts that we have of Jesus' life, both those that are in the New Testament and some writings that are outside the New Testament. People recognize that Jesus was a prophet, and his prophetic work was backed up by healing. And if Jesus was killed, if he was put to death by religious and political authorities, this claim to his being a prophet is not challenged. The claim to him being a prophet, powerful in word and deed, could remain. But this story says so much more. This story says that he was Messiah. Messiah simply means king or Christ. He's the king of the Jews. He's the one who should lead and represent the nation. Why does this matter? The death of Jesus wouldn't risk the claims to being a prophet, but they would crush the claims to being a Messiah. Nobody would think Jesus was Messiah if he was dead. Think about it like this. If someone was running for president or prime minister and they won, but before taking office, they tragically died, nobody would insist that they were still acting or functioning prime minister or president. If they were dead, they can't be prime minister. They can't be president. If Jesus is dead, then he isn't Messiah. And if you wanted to preserve his honor as a prophet, then you wouldn't go about insisting that he was Messiah even though he was dead. Instead, you would simply try to do things as he taught them. You would honor his memory by doing what he taught. In other words, you could seek to follow his teaching without insisting he was more than what he was. Insisting he was Messiah or Christ or King only makes sense if he's alive, if he was raised from the dead. By claiming that Jesus was Christ or King or Messiah after his death, then all these smaller claims, like being a powerful prophet, were all put at risk. If Jesus was not really the King or Christ, then his status as prophet or wise man was at risk. Whereas even if he wasn't king, Jesus could still have been these lesser things. Instead, by giving up the smaller claims and insisting on the bigger ones, people like Cleopas give us evidence to believe in the resurrection. But it's more than that. In this story, Jesus doesn't shy away from his death. None of the New Testament does. It's not a nasty bit of business that detracts from the whole thing. Jesus says it's central. The whole New Testament keeps the death of Jesus central. Jesus says in this story, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things? The earliest followers of Jesus didn't shy away from the cross or the death of Jesus. They kept it central. It was a key component, not only to the life of Jesus, but of what it meant to follow him. And why did they keep it so important? Because Jesus said it was. If Jesus stayed dead in a tomb, his words would have been appealed to more naturally through sentiment. They might think, we should do what Jesus said because of his love and his faithfulness and his kindness and so on. But this story doesn't operate with sentiment. It operates with Jesus as the authority of the event where a man who was killed and then raised to life. He is not the story of people who saw that a dead man was actually wise when he was alive. No, this is the account of an event. And their insistence on this point threatens the whole thing. Instead of giving up the smaller claims, like being a prophet, and insisting on the bigger ones, that Jesus was raised from the dead and indeed is Messiah, people like Cleopas give us evidence to believe in the resurrection. And they doubled down on this claim because Jesus was the authority. In fact, they were willing to live their lives in the face of death, not because of sentiment, but because Jesus was raised and truly is the authority. I hope this brief reflection on the story gives you reason to do more investigation into the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. I've given you two reasons for the story. First, consider the resurrection because it's, in spite of great cost to themselves, people told the story. And second, consider the resurrection because in spite of great risk to Jesus' reputation, people told the story. Now, here's what you can do with this encouragement if you want to investigate further. Read part of the New Testament. Start with Luke. I say it like this: look back. Read a very old document about an event that happened a long time ago and see how it reads. See if it holds up. See if it passes what we might call the sniff test. Does it have consistency? Is it credible as you read it? The second reason I want you to consider the resurrection of Jesus is because it explains the rapid presence of the church. After Cleopas and the other unnamed person realize this is Jesus on the road and who has been in their home, they rush back to Jerusalem. They come upon other followers who are hearing and telling the story of Jesus and him appearing to Simon, or who's Peter. And Cleopas and his companion chime in with their own account. Jesus has appeared to them as well. Now, remember the story started with the two leaving the group who had heard the tomb was empty. Cleopas and his companion didn't believe it, and so they took off. It's the resurrection that brings them back. Think about how humble they must have been. They didn't believe, but now they do. They have to eat some humble pie to go back to the group. They had not believed the women, but now they can't help but believe. It would be humbling to return to this group, but the resurrection gave them every reason to do so. In fact, it wasn't just this group of Christians or believers in Jesus that gathered. They gathered all over the place. Within 25 years of Jesus' life and death, little and large groups of people gathered all across the Roman Empire in Jesus' name. All around the Mediterranean Sea and major cities of commerce and politics, groups gathered because they believed Jesus had been raised from the dead. These groups came about without violence, without threat, and without political power. They were comprised of radically different people from radically different backgrounds who spoke different primary languages. And they developed a new social ethic. Something happened to spark this movement. What was it? I suggest it was the resurrection. Now, you might say these local churches developed because people wanted churches. You might say that churches met a psychological need. But these local churches brought about challenges for all their members. They challenged the attitudes of the poor to the powerful. They challenged the use of money by the wealthy. They challenged the responsibilities of parents to children. They challenged the importance of everyone sharing what they had. And they challenged the primary allegiance of citizens. In other words, while they might have had some benefits, they brought some significant inconveniences and challenges for everybody. A new social ethic was growing in the church, and it was not an easy one to follow. Something has to explain why they were willing to do so. You might say, well, the resurrection story developed after the church to explain the phenomenon. But again, this would be a very strange development. First, it would be strange because it would require a great coordinated effort across regions. Second, it would be strange because the people who kept preaching the resurrection were the ones doing this hard work. They were affirming an event. If they had made it up, they would be affirming an event that never happened, but that only gave them a risky, low-rewarding, difficult life that was filled with suffering. The resurrection is no convenient explanation to the rise of the church. The earliest followers of Jesus told the story of the resurrection not as an illustration, not as a metaphor. They told it as an event. They were not trying to illustrate a profound truth. They didn't use an event to illustrate a message. They told about an event and then acted in accordance with it. They told about the resurrection and gathered in the name of Jesus because this event truly turned their lives upside down. The first reason I gave you to consider to investigate the claims of the resurrection is because of the presence of testimony. The second reason I want to give you to investigate the claims to resurrection is that it gives explanation to the rise of the early church. So consider the resurrection of Jesus because it's a plausible root explanation for the rapid expansion and nature of local churches. So what might you do? This is going to take some work. But I want you to hang out with the church for 6 months or a year. Go to their services, talk to their people, investigate how they do life. See what happens. See how they live. What are they like? What do they do? What do they do when they gather together? How do they serve others? See what kind of people they are. See whether or not they hold other people in the church accountable to the life and teaching of Jesus, or at least if they try to. I know that's a time commitment, but some things in life are worth asking and takes time to ask them. Sometimes discerning life's biggest questions takes time and attention. If the first encouragement I gave you was to look back by reading the Gospel of Luke, this time I want to say, look around. Look around at a community or in a community that is gathering in Jesus' name. This brings me to the third encouragement I have for you to investigate the claim of the resurrection. And it's a bit of a different one from the first two. First one was to look back, and the second one was to look around. The third one is look in. The third reason I encourage you to consider the resurrection of Jesus, this claim, is because it fits with the presence of life's longings. The most haunting words of this story that I told to you are clear to me. When Cleopas and his companions say, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." In the context of the story, it means we had hoped he would set things right for our people, for our nation. In the context of history, it's a hope that has extended back about 600 years when the remaining people of Israel were exiled to Babylon. Let me give you a bit of a lighthearted story to get at the depth of this feeling. I am a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. There's my Wendell Clark bobblehead. And there's my stuffed teddy bear. I really am a Maple Leafs fan. People often point to the long time longing of Maple Leafs fans to win the cup. Sometimes even my friends do. They say the Leafs last won the cup in 1967, and this is 2020. They love to point out how that's 53 years ago. It is a long time. Maple Leafs fans, I can say, are longing. Every other year or so, the Leafs get a player who revives a sense of fresh excitement. People start to think, this is the one to end the Stanley Cup drought for the blue and white. He's the one who will make the streets of Toronto run blue. And every year the same. We had hoped. We had hoped. We had hoped. I can only tell you, as a Maple Leafs fan, this longing is real. It matters deep down. And the letdown is profound. But it is microscopic compared to the hopes of Cleopas and his companion that they share here. It is microscopic compared to the "we had hoped" that this would be the one to redeem Israel that they share. The death of Jesus was the dashing of their hopes. It was the dashing of their hopes in Jesus, and it was the dashing and a testing of their faith in God. The hope for restoration and redemption, for Israel to be rejoined, united, and to start winning on the global stage and the national stage, to keep winning, was far, 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 far deeper than any longing for a sports team. The longing of Cleopas and his companion, the "we had hoped for" kind of longing, strikes and illustrates the deepest longing of humankind. We have a longing for meaning. We hope that life is meaningful, that it counts for something. We have a longing for justice. We see things that are wrong beyond our ability to set right, and we want them to be set right. We have a longing for goodness. We want those who are in charge and those who have authority and those who are in positions of power to be good people. I think you should investigate and consider the resurrection of Jesus, because resurrection fits all of these "we had hoped for" kind of longings. The resurrection of Jesus fits them all. In the hit movie Avengers: Age of Ultron, different characters try to lift Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Bruce Banner, although he's not the Hulk at the time, can't do it. Tony Stark, even with the help of Rhodey and both of their suits, can't do it. Up steps Captain America. He gives a hard tug, and the audience thinks they see the hammer budge just a bit. Thor's face goes into this kind of expression of surprise and worry and shock, almost hope. But alas, not even Captain America can lift the hammer. Lifting Mjolnir, you see, is not simply a matter of brute strength. There's a certain worthiness to it. There's a fittingness to lifting the hammer. Now, Jesus had lived a life fitting of the Messiah. It was a strange fit, not exactly what the people had expected, but it was a fittingness that roused feelings of hope in Cleopas and his companion and other people. They had hoped. When Captain America can't lift Mjolnir, there's evidently something about him that just doesn't fit this task. But if you're an Avengers fan, then I expect you know how the story progresses. In Avengers Endgame, audiences around the world reacted to Thor's hammer flying through the air to be caught by Cap. He could lift it, he could wield it, and now it all fit. Not just the fact that Cap could wield the hammer, but the timing. Captain America lifting Mjolnir fit. His character fit, the timing fit. And resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus, fits. It fits not only the life of Jesus and how he had lived it, it fits our deepest longings with deepest satisfaction. In our deepest selves, we want our lives to count. We might have different ways of expressing this desire and different things that we do that are tried to count, to make our lives meaningful. For some people, if they can just get mom or dad to say, "I am so proud of you," life will count. For others, if they can earn 6 figures, then life will count. For others, they find meaning in other pursuits, and other people reach their pursuits and still have no meaning. In our deepest selves, we want our lives to count. And there are many ways that people go about achieving meaning, and some of them are deeply meaningful and important. What I want you to see is that the resurrection of Jesus says the faithful life counts. It fits our desire for meaningful action. If Jesus is raised from the dead, then these longings make sense. Life does have meaning. Jesus' life does not simply lie in a grave to be forgotten at some point. His life counted, and our lives matter too. Life matters. Our longing for meaning matches the work of God. God raised Jesus from the dead, giving meaning to his life, and our longing for meaning matches this event. We long for meaning, and resurrection shows that God gives meaning. Second, in our deepest selves, we want there to be justice. If Jesus lies dead, then the grossest injustice has been served. Jesus healed people, fed people, restored people, dignified people, changed people. And he was killed because of a conspiracy. That is gross injustice. But the resurrection of Jesus meets the longing for justice. If Jesus is raised from the dead, then God cares about justice. Our longing for justice reflects the very creator of the world. Our longing for justice matches the nature of God. We care about justice, and resurrection fits that God cares about justice too. In our deepest selves, we long for goodness. There's a phrase that says, never meet your heroes, because our heroes can disappoint us. They don't turn out to be the people who are the ones we expect them to be. Maybe they're selfish and even focused on themselves. It's only a matter of time in life until someone very important to you lets you down in a profound way. In our deepest selves, we know it shouldn't be so. In our deepest selves, we long for goodness. The resurrection of Jesus fits this longing because Jesus is good. Think about it like this. Jesus has been put to death, an excruciating death by crucifixion. And now he's alive. It's his first day. To whom does he go? Not to the people who put him to death to even the score, not to crowds of people to gain fame. He goes to a couple of runaways, a couple of people who don't believe he's alive. Sometimes we might ask, why didn't Jesus make the resurrection more obvious? Or why isn't God's existence more obvious? Friends, that's the nature of God. God is good. To put it in a different kind of way, God isn't arrogant. He is humble. The resurrection of Jesus, including just the way it was revealed, perfectly matches our longing for goodness, that the one who has such power is good, that the one who has such power is humble. We long for goodness, and the resurrection of Jesus fits that longing. Notice the beautiful unfolding of this story in this final scene. Jesus has appeared among the two and accepts their chiding. Don't you know? Haven't you heard? You must be the only one who doesn't know. And Jesus has his own playful response. How foolish you are and slow to believe. It's not a harsh you fools. It's a you fools. And so these walkers only see Jesus. They only see him when they share their home and food with him. They see this humble king when they are humble and share as well. But instead of Jesus being hosted, he becomes the host. He's the humble host in our own home. Humble host, modest monarch, courteous king. The resurrection isn't flashy and extravagant. It's humble and modest and good. The resurrection of Jesus fits our longings for meaning, justice, and goodness. So I say it's worth investigating. Now, some very perceptive listeners here might say, but isn't that a reason why resurrection might not be true? That it meets deep longings, and so the early Christians said that Jesus was raised. It met their psychological challenges, so they testified to this story. Isn't that a reason why they might have invented it? Let me offer two responses to this insightful challenge. First, there might have been some who would have been able and interested in convincing themselves that in spite of the scent of a decaying body, the sight of a sealed tomb, and the silence of Jesus' voice, that Jesus has been raised. There might have been some who could convince themselves that he was raised despite all the evidence to the contrary. But I don't think it could have been that many. His death would have left more people like Cleopas and his companion, more people who were we had hoped kind of people. I don't think it would leave them people of faith, but people of cynicism. And again, to put it in a silly way, if you want to know what some cynical people are like, talk to some Toronto Maple Leafs fans who have lost hope. Talk to some Toronto Maple Leafs fans who are we had hoped kind of people. We had hoped can lead to some strange optimism, but to others, it is deep despair. Second, the resurrection of Jesus challenges our own arrogance. This story would have been a strange one to invent because it has such deep challenge to us. If death is the great equalizer, then resurrection is the great differentiator. In resurrection, Jesus is placed ahead of everyone else. It's a truth that fits our longings for meaning, justice, and goodness, but it's certainly not a convenient truth. It's a crushing truth. It rearranges everything. It displaces everything. It causes me to reconsider all of my life's aims and purposes and meaning. I gave you a couple of reasons to investigate the resurrection. Number one, investigate the resurrection because of the presence of testimony. I said to do that, look back, read the gospel according to Luke. Number two, investigate the claims to resurrection because it explains the rise of the early church. And to do that, I said, jump in with a church, explore a community that gathers in Jesus' name and see what they're like. Number three, I've said to look in, see how this claim is worth investigating because it fits life's deepest longings. And here's the action I want you to take. As you investigate the claims to resurrection, reading books, talking with people, see if the claim and the wider narrative of Jesus fits the longings that reside deep in your life. See if it fits the longings that reside in your bones, deep in your own heart. As you read Luke and as you get to know a community centered on Jesus, see if your heart starts to burn in you. See if it seems that Jesus is making a home in your life. Look back, look around, look in. 3 reasons that you should investigate the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. A man named Jesus was put to death by the collusion of governing authorities, both religious and political. And after a day and a half of being dead, he was seen again alive. He was seen by a lot of people, at least some of whom were credible, and a movement started and has continued in his name and has been going on for 2,000 years. Will you explore this claim?